So welcome to this discussion on loyalty in an age of whistleblowing and Wikileaks. I wanted to explore this issue at this year's Battle of Ideas because there's been an increasing demand for transparency in the world of politics, in the world of corporations. It's become something of a hurrah word. And that means that exchanges that are held in confidence or off the record or in private are often seen as somehow suspicious or sinister. You've had examples recently of something that is known as Govegate. In case you missed this, this was when the Education Secretary of the coalition government, Michael Gove, was found to be using emails on Gmail so that they couldn't be solicited into the public sphere through Freedom of Information Act. And so this idea that, you can't say anything officially because it's bound to end up in the public realm has led to people going behind the scenes to try and have private conversations. But the reason why that context is important is because I think that in that context we make heroes of people who leak information, we make heroes of whistleblowers, and anybody who is seen to expose private transactions of politicians or of corporations is now lauded as being important. This debate is not about Julian Assange. He now has slightly been discredited, but Bradley Manning, who was accused originally of leaking the trove of classified documents that led to Wikileaks, is considered to be a hero for making that information available. Barack Obama at one point, not in relation to Wikileaks, but in relation to whistleblowing, said, "Whistleblowing is an act of courage and patriotism and should be encouraged rather than stifled." Now, it seemed to me that this was a very different atmosphere than that of the past, when we might have thought that being loyal and not leaking confidential information was a positive thing. So we just wanted to explore that. First of all, we have Gwyn Prins sitting next to me, who is research professor at the London School of Economics and the director of the LSE Mackinder Programme for Study of Long-Wave Events. He was for over 20 years a fellow tutor and director of studies in history at Emmanuel College at Cambridge, and is currently a senior academic advisor to the Defence Academy of the UK and a member of the Chief of Defence Staff's Strategy Advisory Panel. He coordinates the Hartwell Group and is lead author of the Hartwell paper, A New Direction for Climate Policy After the Crash of 2009. Backed by popular demand, Joyce McMillan, she's the theatre critic of the Scotsman, based in Edinburgh, but she also writes more broadly on political and social issues. She's a well-known voice of politics and always insightful within Scotland, and I don't think she's got as well a known voice in the broader UK, which is why I'm always pleased to have her here. She's been involved in the Scottish and European campaigns for democracy and human rights, is convener of the Scottish Civic Forum from 2002 to 4, and is now the chair of the Hansard Society Working Group in Scotland, and is a member of the judging panel for Saltaire's Scottish Book of the Year Award. Next is Mick Hume, who is a regular Battle of Ideas contributor. He's the editor of the online magazine Spiked, editor at large, having founded Spiked Online and being the former editor, and he also writes for the Times, and I find his articles always insightful and well worth reading. He was the editor of LM magazine, which was launched originally as Living Marxism, which I was involved when it was LM as co-publisher. That was until it was forced to close in the year 2000 following a libel suit, and then he launched Spiked. Next up is Richard Sexton, who is a partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers and on the UK Exec Board of PwC. PwC, as you know, are a headline partner of the Battle of Ideas, and we've thoroughly enjoyed our collaboration over the period of time, which has actually been very intellectually full rather than anything technical at all. It's actually been a source of, I hope, intellectual stimulation. Richard himself has been an assurance and audit practitioner throughout his career and has worked with major clients in a number of industries such as Unilever and Reuters. We know him because he oversees the aspects of the firm's public policy in relation to reputation, and through that has been exploring the issue of trust. Last but not least, and I've been delighted to entice him back because it was a few years ago that he spoke, we have Henry Porter. Henry is a political columnist at The Observer. Henry's actually something of a hero, I think, for those who are involved in civil liberties in this country, because he has written over 100 columns chronicling the attack on liberty and rights in Britain, and without whom I think we wouldn't have thought about the issues or known about the issues if it wasn't for him. He's also, as it happens, a UK editor of Vanity Fair, and he's also a novelist who's written 6 novels. The latest is The Dying Light, which I love, and I recommend you all to read because I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a political thriller set in a few years in the future. He won the Ian Fleming Steel Dagger Award for the best thriller with Brandenburg, which was set against the backdrop of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I always think that having a journalist with those kind of insights and a novelist to boot is worth having on the panel.
Well, at least I do know why I'm here. It was because of what I said on The Moral Maze. Excellent. But the title of this session seems to me really not quite accurate enough. We have virtually got an A to Z of leaking, actually an A to W, because it goes from Assange to Werity. And now we know that it goes via G, because of course it goes via Michael Gove, who, just to give it clear context, does what any of us who are now involved in a public institution and whose public emails therefore fall under the Freedom of Information Act have to do. I make no communications of any sort on my LSE email that I would wish the rest of the world not to see. And that's a ridiculous and unintended consequence of the Freedom of Information legislation. Anyway, I'm here because of the argument which I made, so let me quickly rehearse it because we want to get stuck into the debate. What I argued then, and what I think now, is that the WikiLeakers were irresponsible, disloyal, they deserved fully legal sanction, all the things it says on the tin in the calling notice. And why is that so? Because if you experience the benefits of Leviathan, that is to say, the protection against the enemy without and the enemy within, if you think in a democracy that it's wise that you should surrender the monopoly of violence to the state and that each person should not walk around fully armed, then that brings with it responsibilities, and it also brings with it inevitable surrenders. You have to pay part of your money for taxes. You can argue about what it's spent on, but you also have to surrender the absolute freedom to inquire into absolutely everything, because to keep you safe, there are certain things which it really wouldn't be very helpful for the rest of the world to know. The WikiLeakers don't accept that. So why don't they accept that? Second point, because they are culpably soft-headed. The soft-headedness, which is their want, comes actually from one of the most profound cultural rifts which we have in society today. They're an extreme part of a narrative about the modern world which believes that we have finally achieved Immanuel Kant's goal of perpetual peace. We have, for the first time in modern society, achieved a moment at which peace is the default condition of normality. And if you believe that, it has a profound effect on how you look both at the rest of the world and at your moral responsibilities, both to yourself, to those who you care about, and to the strangers with whom you share the compact, the social compact within society. On the other hand, if you're on the other side of that divide, as I am, and if you believe that the lights are on, that we have food, that I was able to travel on a bus, that I was on a better train line than Henry, he was on the not-so-great Western, I was on the rather more modest Southern line, and that all these things happened, that was not an accident, because there are always bad things waiting to happen. And the fact that they don't happen is because someone stands on a wall, somebody deters or somebody preempts. And if you believe that, then there are consequences which follow. So clearly there's an important division there to be recognized. Anyway, that's broadly my position, but knowing that I was coming here, on Wednesday evening I thought I should do some field research, so I put on a dinner jacket and a bow tie and went down to St. Paul's Cathedral. I went down and had a very interesting half an hour or so with the earnest young people who were milling in and out and around the tents, and I read their posters on the various columns which are there outside Marks and Spencer's, because I wanted to find out something which might be useful for our discussion today, because in addition to all various things that Claire said about my actual origins, is that I'm an African anthropologist. I lived in the bush for 10 years. So I'm very interested not just in what people think, but how they think them and the way that they hold their ideas. If you go down to St. Paul's Cathedral, and I do recommend it, There you will find a poster which says, "Occupy everything." You will also find another which is called a parable. A parable explains in a rather splendid sort of sub-St. James's version language that the moneymen who control and run St. Paul's Cathedral as a lucrative undertaking, and they confessed it because they were smoked out, these people justify the occupation. Indeed, the consequence of them making that argument is that we are going to stay here forever. So I then talked to the young people, and what I heard was comprehensive conspiracy theories. Everything is a conspiracy theory. And for those of you who know anything about the history of anarchism, it's not very unfamiliar. Claire knows this well. It's a sort of Kropotkin mixture in which there is no trust and consequently no obligation of loyalty. There shouldn't be any trust because it is quite clear that there is no circumstance or individual or institution deserving of the receipt of your trust, because everything, as I say, is a conspiracy against you. The conversation with one young woman, a well-spoken young lady with pieces of metal, which were, I thought, not particularly an addition to her attractiveness, but an earnest person, having explained to me that it was McDonald's and McDonnell Douglas who were taking over the world and so on, and that capitalism was an unmitigated evil, I asked mildly how the food got into the Marks and Spencers that was just over there. This, without missing a beat, she told me was also a conspiracy, because the food that you get there is not properly organic, and so therefore it poisons your body, which has resonances by the way of Dr. Strangelove, for those of you who remember the mad colonel commanding the airbase who was obsessed with the pollution of his bodily essences. And in any case, it was much too expensive food, because people like us can't have it, so therefore it's a conspiracy against us too. Right. What is this an example of? Well, it's a sort of soft version of an IT-enabled globalization model. It's what Lord Giddens, in one of his early books on this, describes as the disembedded identity, where you get time-space distanciation, and my Lord should be very careful about what he wishes for. What's more interesting than the statements, however, is the shape, and my last comment in the last 45 seconds is that those of you who know anything about the anthropology of ideas will recognize what I've described very easily, and know therefore why it's so difficult to have a discussion with people who hold these ideas. This is a classic encapsulated belief system. It's entirely self-closed. It's the same structure of ideas that are held by Islamists, or indeed others who have unconditional beliefs, because it is always possible to find a way to disqualify any criticism, as for example in the example about Marks and Spencers. So when you're confronted with that, the consequence, and here is a paradox, is that it then legitimates a really quite totalitarian reaction against people that you don't agree with. The final point I should make about the young woman was I said, well, who do you believe in? And the answer is that she believed in something, I wrote it down, something which was called lovingness. Lovingness is something which embraces all over the world, through her iPhone, all of those people who are in New York or who are camped out as part of the Occupy protest in Madrid. All of these people she has never met but has high trust in. And they form a different sort of community, and they legitimate, therefore, the use of any means in order to obtain information about a persecuting state. Now, in those circumstances, there is no debate to be had, and that's why we find ourselves having to prosecute such people as vigorously as has to be done, and indeed as they deserve.
The question raised by the title of the session was the obvious one, really, of loyalty to what? And it actually occasioned in me quite a lot of a kind of realisation of what a dangerous and exciting and profound transition our societies have been going through in the last generation. The other night, I had because I'm a theatre critic, I had the very good experience of going to the Citizens Theatre in Glasgow and watching a play called The Day and the Death of Joe Egg, which many of you will recognise in one of its forms. It's a play that was first performed in 1967, written by Peter Nichols, about a young couple who, despite kind of living in the swinging 60s and being surrounded by the sort of symbols of freedom of that decade, have had a child who is very profoundly handicapped and are therefore crushed with obligation, as it were, at a time when the society all around them is talking about new freedoms and about shaking off the traditional pieties, if you like, of family or religious or indeed of patriotic obligation. And it just reminded me how profoundly our society has changed, you know, since that period, the 1960s, which we all see as a kind of defining decade of change, in terms of the abandonment. I think piety is probably the best word for it. We are now not pious about much, or at least unless, like the young lady that Richard describes, we've found a new set of pieties. What we've abandoned in terms of our collective sense of what we ought to be very respectful of and very pious about is immense. And what we have rediscovered in terms of new agendas for ourselves is much more fragmented and so far much more fragile. But I say so far because I don't think the process is by any means finished. That's the first thing that we have to grasp about the society that we're living in. That whereas if you had said to a group of British people half a century ago, you should show some loyalty and respect, everyone, they might have argued a bit about it, but they would have known exactly what it was that they were supposed to be being loyal to. You know, the crown, the patriotic agenda, the country that won the Second World War, the place that had founded the welfare state or whatever it was. There was a sort of sense of a common project which you could object to or belong to, but generally speaking, people knew what the common project was and what it was that they were supposed to be being loyal to. Secondly, I was very interested in what Richard said about the absence of war, because I do think it is much, much easier to demand loyalty and, if you like, subservience to the leadership group from people in situations where they feel that they are clearly at war. And it's interesting that one of the great dividing disputes really in British society over the last decade has been the one about whether we are at war or not. I mean, I would say a clear majority of the British people objected to George Bush telling the Western world that we were at war after 9/11 and to Tony Blair just going along with that. And people came out in unprecedented numbers to demonstrate against that attempt to kind of put us back in a war situation, which we felt didn't authentically describe whatever the situation after 9/11 was. So the absence of war makes deference much more difficult, just as the absence of an agreed set of religious and national and sort of family pieties does. And then finally, of course, there's the whole kind of expansion of personal freedom and autonomy in our society, which is a tremendous thing. But what it has done is to put many, many more people into situations where they are living in vast cities, in huge communities of people, where there is very little intimacy. And this is something that I can talk about a little bit from the Scottish perspective, because Scotland, of course, is a much, much smaller national community. It's only got it's got fewer people than London in the whole country. And the cities are much, much smaller. So the sort of boss city of Scotland, Edinburgh, has got less than 500,000 people in it, which makes it a tiny town, really, by modern standards. And in those situations, it's quite an interesting little laboratory of the upsides and downsides of a situation where there is a slightly higher level still of intimacy and trust. And there is now a kind of running litany of complaint from at least some in Scottish society that Alex Salmond, the present Scottish First Minister, gets a very easy ride on issues to do with transparency and exactly what he's up to in his sort of phone calls to businessmen and all the rest of it, simply because people go, oh, it's just Alex, you know, I was at school with him, he's all right, you know. But that this kind of intimacy within a nation tends to conduce to a higher level of trust, but also to the negatives of that, which involve a kind of very slack attitude, really, to holding people to account. What we're dealing with is a society where all the different bases of mutual trust in the society that were traditional, the traditional bases for that, have progressively been knocked out. We live in larger communities, we live in communities that don't share the same ideological or patriotic or religious or political agendas, and we live in communities which, by and large, as Richard says, are not agreed that they are at war with some other community and therefore need to show a bit of discipline. And there's a kind of general lamentation in our society society now, that this loss of trust does represent a loss of social capital. It's very time-wasting and it's quite corrosive. And I think these are some of the points that Claire and Richard have already raised, that if people are constantly having to be evasive in order to be able to have private conversations, if they're constantly having to give an account of what they're doing rather than just getting on and doing it, if they're constantly having to meet kind of rather mechanical standards of accountability and transparency rather than focusing on the task in hand, then obviously it represents a huge drain on time. So in that sense, you could see, you know, the sort of obsession with transparency in our society as a very high social cost, often for a not very great return. But on the other hand, I don't see, I think it's a symptom of a huge social change and not a phenomenon in itself. And therefore, I don't see how you can really reverse it. I think it's like a period that we have to go through in order to reach something better. I am interested in all the points, just to finish, that Richard made at the end of his speech about conspiracy theory and about the influence of conspiracy theory on dissenters, if you like, from our current system. And I do think that's a problem. They're completely closed systems of thought, and it's impossible to argue. But I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that there are good reasons for being dissenting and distrustful of the systems that we live in, which are not conspiracy theories. They are just to do with lies. And that, again, the Iraq War debate was the locus classicus of that, where it turned out that, in fact, the whole political community had been comprehensively lied to in a situation where there weren't even proper notes being made of so-called cabinet meetings or so-called inner cabinet meetings. So it seems to me that we're actually in a transitional period in our society, and that we have to regard this obsession with openness and this lack of trust as a kind of symptom of a huge social change, but perhaps as something that we're moving through rather than permanently stuck with.
Two problems, one very familiar and getting worse, and another more recent, which is making everything worse still. First one, the crisis of commitment in society and the absence of loyalty to anything much, not only to traditional symbols like the crown or the flag, but to anything much in the way of a replacement. And one of the symptoms of that Claire's already talked about is the way that something like whistleblowing has gone from being something which is extraordinary and exceptional to being something which is completely normal. Rather than being an act of betrayal, it's seen as your duty to blow the whistle in all circumstances. It's something we might characterise as a symptom of the Carlos Tevez society, which is basically a footballer who, as soon as he joins one club, wants to join another one and moves on at whim. And I think that's kind of a footballer as a role model for society in a different way than we are perhaps normally talk about. I could also argue that actually footballers are just mercenaries who are not under any obligation to feel any loyalty to their clubs, and they're quite entitled to strike in the way that he did, the same as any other employee is. But that wouldn't suit my metaphor, so I'm not going to talk about that. The Carlos Tevez society, which few feel much loyalty to anything more than themselves, that I think is a well-established and worsening problem. But the second problem I think we ought to talk about, which is making that worse, the norms have become so suspicious and so conformist that when people do show some commitment to something, especially something outside of state control or state endorsement, then that commitment and loyalty is viewed as suspect immediately. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about in relation to the riots. There was a lot of breastbeating around the recent disturbances in England about the fact that why were these young people, as one Labour spokesman said, cannibalising their own streets, cannibalising their own communities. And obviously the reason was they weren't in their communities. They didn't feel any commitment or attachment to those communities. It was a very kind of visible sign of a crisis of commitment and loyalty in a community, people burning down their own neighbourhoods to no apparent purpose. Where people do show some commitment or loyalty in society today that is outside of the control or the endorsement of the authorities and the state, that is often viewed as suspect. So I was saying I think the riots pose this particularly acutely. There is on the one hand a lot of breastbeating about the fact that the young people rioting and burning down buildings in their own areas, looting shops in their own areas, general kind of serious destruction in their own areas, was seen as a symptom of a crisis of community. And as I say, one Labour spokesman talked about it as an act of cannibalism, of destroying your own communities, which the obvious response was these people don't see that as those as their communities. They see no commitment or attachment to those communities that they are living in. A lot of breastbeating about that, but the other side of it, which I thought was very interesting, was that when some people did show some commitment to their communities that was outside of what was officially endorsed, for example, when working class people in areas like Enfield came out in North London, not far from where I live, came out and said that they were prepared to protect their own areas if the police weren't prepared to do it, which they clearly weren't, then the Liberal elite threw their arms up in horror at that and said, we didn't mean that kind of community action, we don't mean that kind of thing, we mean, get your brooms out and sweep up the broken glass, pose for pictures. We don't mean come out with your baseball bats and say, we're going to defend our streets if you're not prepared to. That kind of community action sent a kind of shudder of disgust and all kinds of discussion about vigilantism and fascism and so on. Unless, of course, it was done by members of ethnic minority communities in which it was a legitimate defence of their cultural identities and so on. So, but the white working class, no, we can't have them out on the streets. I thought actually it was a very good, very heartening thing to see. Unlike Gwyn, I don't necessarily accept the state's monopoly on the use of violence, and I think people defending their own streets is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. So, but that, I think, was a rather interesting kind of snapshot of the fact that people who did show some commitment there was a kind of horrified reaction to it. In politics, we see the same thing. We all know, obviously, that nobody, or very few people, feel much commitment to the old, exhausted kind of politics and political parties these days, the problem being that nothing has really replaced that. To give people something that they can feel some kind of loyalty or commitment to. And I include in that the St Paul's protesters. I'm sure we all want to kind of have fun at their expense, but, as an old man on the left who's very long in the tooth and whose reaction to these young people is always to say, don't teach your grandmother to read, grandfather in my case, to read Marx. I do feel when you go down there and look at all that, you think, what on earth is this about? These are supposed to be the most committed arm of politics today. What are they actually showing a commitment to? On the one hand, they're all posing as Jesus with these signs of what would Jesus do, and posing in this kind of image. On the other hand, the only concrete demand they seem to have is for independent regulators of the banking system, which I don't think you'll find in the Sermon on the Mount, although you will find it in editorials in the Financial Times. So, it's a very kind of, it's an amorphous, blancmange-like, and there's been a lot of talk about the empty tents at the process at night, that no one's in these tents, and how disgraceful it is. I think it's entirely appropriate, because the whole thing seems to me to be pretty much an empty kind of moral gesture that doesn't really show a commitment to anything very much beyond their own kind of place in the spotlight. So there's a lack of commitment in politics, but what that's made worse, you're not allowed to, or you're under suspicion if you do have your own political commitments and your own personal loyalties in political life. And that's why I think the Liam Fox stuff and the Michael Gove stuff coming. I mean, I think Liam Fox is an idiot abroad, we might call him, in his actions as a defence secretary, and not knowing the difference between his man friend and a ministerial advisor. But the broader reaction to that, which is saying that there is something wrong with having aides and personal contacts that you've discussed politics with, that all of that has got to be public. Everything's got to be published. We need full lists of everyone you talk to under any circumstances to know what's going on. Similarly with Michael Gove, Govegate, the Education Secretary, that you can't send emails to people unless they're subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Everything's got to be exposed. I think showing that those kind of loyalties and connections and kind of personal circles immediately are seen as suspicious, I think is a big problem in politics. It's what we might call this kind of cult of transparency and whistleblowing. That means you must expose everything about everybody in political life. Because everything is, as that loon Assange says, conspiracy behaviour. He doesn't talk about specific conspiracies, by the way. I don't advise you to, but if you're ever reading this stuff on conspiracies, you find he doesn't talk about specific conspiracies, he talks about conspiracy behaviour. I think that when you take it to that length, you end up making politics and government impossible. Because you cannot have any worthwhile public debate, any worthwhile public argument, unless you've had the chance privately to formulate it, to discuss it, to hone it, to reach a point of what it is you want to say in public, including in a forum like this. That's a real recipe for people going through the motions of transparency while saying as little as they possibly can. And that's a really dangerous trend. And I think what you should be interested in these people, if you want to get them for what they stand for publicly. If you want to go at Liam Fox, when he was Defence Secretary, have a go at him for his conduct in Afghanistan and Libya, not for the fact that he meets his best mate in ingenious circumstances in the ministry or around the world. It's their public political positions that we should be focusing our fire on. It doesn't just count for the Tories either. It's not, I mean, I have no wish, you know, in normal circumstances to make a great play of defending Tory cabinet ministers, but it isn't just Tories that are affected by this. Even old leftists like myself are accused, and there are whole websites dedicated to this, of being part of sinister political circles because we have political loyalties to people who know it a long time. I'm sitting next to Claire Fox here. This is evidence. The fact that I'm involved in the very dangerous and sinister political circle because I've known Claire for a long time and she used to publish a Marxist magazine that I was the editor of. Clearly there is something there that must be exposed. You know, we get caught up in this stuff as well and told that everything must be out and transparent in public. Well, I can tell you that my politics and my political arguments are completely transparent. I mean, they may not be, but if they're not, it's because they're not very well written. But they are attempted to be completely transparent. You'll find them in Spiked and elsewhere, and I entirely believe every word that I write and say in public, and I'm happy to defend any of it. The rest of it is none of yours. You know, how it is that I reach those positions, who I talk to, what I read and what happened, that's an entirely separate sphere of political life that I have to be allowed to do, and everyone has to be allowed to do for themselves. So the question is just to conclude, you know, do we really want to live in a society where everything is transparent, where every meeting and every email has got to be made public, or where everybody you know has got to be on a register and before you're allowed to meet them, where nobody's allowed to think or discuss privately or do anything without the sanction of perhaps the state or certainly of the media, and where whistleblowing becomes the norm and everybody has a duty to be a whistleblower and a leaker at all times. I don't know about you, but to me, that sounds like a kind of wiki-Stasi. You know, I don't want to be over-dramatic about it, but it's kind of not so much Big Brother is watching you as Big Brother is wiki-leaking you. You know, Big Brother is whistleblowing on you. You know, your every move is under surveillance from on high. And I think you're in danger of ending up with a kind of stifling conformism where everybody says the right thing, goes through the motion because they know what they're supposed to say, but nobody believes what they say. Nobody believes themselves what they're saying, and therefore no one in the audience can be expected to believe it either. Because when everybody is blowing whistles, you know, how are you ever going to hear yourself think? The slogan which I have always adhered to in my journalism and propaganda work, ever since the days of living Marxism in the old days, is one I borrow from my old mate Karl Marx: question everything. That's my motto in journalism and politics: question everything. But today, and I still hold to that, but today I think that equally has to mean questioning the whistleblowers. You know, questioning the orthodoxy must also mean questioning the whistleblowers and the WikiLeakers when they have become the conformists.
I thought it was fascinating that Joyce talked about they just knew. That was how you got loyalty. And it made me think about whether loyalty is an abused asset, whether loyalty, or perhaps more aptly blind faith, is actually quite dangerous. From a personal perspective, and Mick opened this up because he started talking about sports, I have blind faith in the England rugby team. I am very loyal to the England rugby team. Now, you might say, why? But nevertheless, that loyalty persists, notwithstanding poor results, notwithstanding some of the behaviour. And it's quite interesting because then I reflect on, so why am I loyal to a sporting organisation, a sporting team in that way? And it must be because I don't really understand why I am loyal. So for me it was quite fascinating to reflect on that in a business context, and I just want to pick up on one or two things that we've been talking about and perhaps develop them a little bit further. I think the environment from a business perspective creates some really interesting challenges if you focus on loyalty. Put to one side for a moment the wikis and think about loyalty. See, I think loyalty is engendered through an understanding of long-term goals, trajectory, something that I can relate to and then understand if things go wrong along the way, is that a bump in the road which will be corrected back to that long-term trajectory that we have an understanding of? Or is it a fundamental change or a disrupting event that I no longer know whether I can be loyal? So that ability to develop and signal long-term intent is critically important, particularly in a world where you have a higher degree of transparency and immediate transparency, where you cannot develop the arguments around transparency to the extent of explaining how they fit in with that long-term trajectory. So I think that framework of long-termism is critically important. And if you reflect that in today's business world, and indeed politics, and indeed pretty much every area of life, we operate from a very, very short-term agenda. What's happening now, tomorrow, today, not what's happening next week, next year. I can't wait for that. I want to know what's happening now. This is supposedly where Generation Y sit, and maybe there are some in the audience who will contribute from that perspective. But if you create that short-termism, I think it makes the creation of loyalty even harder, and therefore having a frame against which I can judge, am I willing to continue to be loyal, much, much more difficult. And institutions struggle with that. It's actually endemic with certain institutions like the political arena because they just cannot be long-term. It's a pathological inability to talk about their long-term goals, perhaps because they believe that would be unpalatable to us as a wider community. So I think we need to come back to that. The other aspect from a business perspective, which is critical when you think about loyalty, and in particular whistleblowing, is you have to be very careful how you incentivise whistleblowing. Whistleblowing today, along with immunity for those who are first to blow the whistle, creates a very dangerous dynamic. It says that if I misbehave, I can get off scot-free, provided I implicate 2 or 3 or 4 other parties. And we have built that into some of our structures, built that into some very powerful organisations, including competition activities, so that the perpetrator of crime can use whistleblowing as a way of avoiding the consequences of their own behaviour. And I can't believe that was what it was intended for. But I think you have to be very careful with whistleblowing. I support it. I think it's a very, very valuable, very useful tool to make sure you have a strong ethos around. But whistleblowing should be a last resort. It should be the resort of having pursued all other means to attempt to get your message across, rather than the immediate course of action to create sensation and create publication of views that might otherwise not be heard. Because immediately you use that whistleblowing route, then you throw into great question the ability to ever recapture loyalty. And that is a very, very dangerous position to be in when whistleblowing itself was designed to protect the very few instances where you cannot pursue a normal course of action because you would be shut down. You would be told to be quiet, you would be constrained in your views, and I don't think that's very healthy, but you have to be careful how you use it. So I'd leave you with those thoughts that business itself can, I think, create a much higher level of loyalty by coming back to purpose, by coming back to its long-term goals and why they are relevant to society. I think politicians could learn an awful lot from that. And I think whistleblowing is a useful tool used in moderation and very carefully with the right environment around it, and we are right to challenge its excessive use, which is where it seems to be going today.
First of all, I want to certainly challenge Mick's idea of our societies. I'm always amazed by how stable, often kind our society is. I've spent a lot of the last year with 3 friends in hospital, and seeing the dedication of the people who work way beyond what they're paid for, way beyond the hours, and also the emotional investment. I'm amazed at how you see the same in schools, in youth working organisations and so forth. So I would just like to contradict Mick. I think the society is an astonishingly stable, impressive thing. I spent a lot of the early part of this year in North Africa covering the revolutions there, and I was very struck by how envious they are of the basic qualities of our society. So I'll just say that, put that in the pot. I want to start with a quote from Tony Blair, which you will find on page 516 of his most revealing memoirs. I think they really are an extraordinary document. I recommend them for anyone. He says, freedom of information, 3 harmless words. I look at these words as I write them and feel like shaking my head till it drops off my shoulders. You idiot. You naive, foolish, irresponsible nincompoop. There is no adequate description of the stupidity, no matter how vivid, that is adequate. I quake at the imbecility of it. I just want you to keep that in mind. I'm not an absolutist, though a journalist. I'm not an absolutist. I'm not a fundamentalist about this stuff. I think there should be secrecy, I think there should be privacy, and I think many times things are kept quiet because it is going to protect people, either their lives or their reputations. And I think this is important to realise. I also think that companies and governments and the civil service are owed loyalty because that combined project of what they're doing needs loyalty. However, the break point comes when an individual sees that a decision has been taken and a course of action is being pursued which is against the public interest. Nobody has yet mentioned the public interest. If you think of, for instance, 3 recent stories, the phone hacking story at News International, the dumping of toxic waste by Trafigura off the coast of Côte d'Ivoire, and let me just think of the other one. Well, let me just deal with those 2. If you'd had, banking crisis, if you'd had an inside informer of, say, in Goldman Sachs during the course of Greece's application to join the euro, we would have known that Goldman Sachs fiddled the figures. We would have known in News International that police corruption and the business of phone hacking and possibly email hacking was standard practice in certain of those papers. We would have also known that Trafigura had, from the very top of its management, authorised its dumping of illegal waste. I think the world would have been better if a whistleblower had, from one of those 3 organisations, gone to the press or some form of the media and revealed what was going on. So let me just say that I am firmly for whistleblowing. I think it's an essential part of our democracy. For one reason, I suppose. I happen to believe that power does corrupt, and that the history of the world tells us that people in power do a lot to protect their power and a lot to protect their embarrassment. My second view is that whose information is this? We're paying the government. If something is done in the name of democracy, I believe we should have access to that if it isn't going to damage us or the country's interests. So I believe as much information should be as free as possible, because I think it is a mechanism which makes government work better. I also happen to think that many of the corporations who have gone green or are developing policies to help the environment, that is because there has been pressure from outside. And you wouldn't have it were every boardroom, every government meeting, if it was secret. Secrecy, I think, is probably the enemy of good governance, both in corporate level and in general politics. I think I want to move on to WikiLeaks. When I wrote about this, when it first started to happen, I was nervous, like the editor of The Guardian and the editor of the New York Times, who were both publishing these things. I was nervous that this would be a danger. Now, I challenge anyone to say what has been the damage after a year of these leaks being published, particularly the US cables being dumped last November, December. What has been the damage? At the time, I wrote, I've lost count of the politicians and opinion formers of an authoritarian bent, warning of the dreadful damage done by WikiLeaks, the WikiLeaks dump of diplomatic cables, and in the very next breath dismissing the content as frivolous tittle-tattle. To seek simultaneous advantage from opposing arguments is not a new gambit, but to be wrong in both is quite an achievement. The point I made was that it was tittle-tattle, some of it, and a lot of it was important, but we should have had access to it. It did not do any damage, and you can only, well, it may have done the odd bit of damage, but I'm sure Gwyn will remind me of what it did. But if you went to If you went to Tunisia, you knew that those people had every right to know what Robert Godek, the diplomat who wrote about the ruling family and their mafia-like behaviour and their ownership of practically any enterprise in Tunisia. They had a right to know, and it was one of the things which caused the revolution earlier this year. I just want to go back to why Tony Blair what Tony Blair was saying in his memoirs. He said, the truth is that the FOI Act is not used for most part by the people. It is used by journalists. For political leaders, it's like saying to someone who is hitting you over the head, hey, try this instead, and handing them a mallet. The information is neither sought because the journalist is curious to know, nor given to bestow knowledge on the people. It's used as a weapon. I simply don't think that's right. I simply think that is wrong for the reason. I'd say two words to anyone who says the Freedom of Information Act is destructive of good governance. I say MPs' expenses. We had every right to know that 2/3 of MPs were fiddling their expenses, regarding their expenses as a sort of unofficial salary. We had every right to know that. And had it not been for Heather Brooke gaining that information via Freedom of Information Act request and subsequently getting into the hands of the Daily Telegraph, they would still be doing that, and they would be taking state money. I want to remind you of a hero of mine, John Wilkes, much ignored and neglected individual of the late 18th century. In the 1760s, John Wilkes believed that Parliament should be covered, something we take for absolute granted now. He said that Parliament should be covered, he should be able to write about it, and should also be able to write that the King's speech was written by ministers. This was regarded by the authorities of the day as a dreadful idea. They said that once people knew what was going on in Parliament, the thing would be laughed at, and they think that the proceedings of Parliament would be laughed at, and that they wouldn't be able to hold their heads up and govern the country. This is the argument that went on in the 1760s. Wilkes pursued and pursued his case, and eventually started covering Parliament and allowed others to cover it. It was one of the great achievements of his many, many achievements. He said, and this is my closing word, he said, after he'd achieved this, the people are now made the judges of the conduct of their representatives. I think that applies to both government and corporations. The more information we have, the better we are able to vote at elections or to attend shareholder meetings and question the behaviour of companies.
What I did want to ask, and I think this touches actually on what Richard said, which is, how do you deal with blind loyalty, or as it were, or loyalty when it's misplaced? Because there's no doubt that that can happen. And the way Richard posed it also in terms of whistleblowing as the last resort, which is, I mean, broadly what I support, what I think as well. I think whistleblowing is an absolutely invaluable and important thing to defend, but I'm worried about its compulsory activity at the moment. But how do you feel about that?
Let me answer it like this. I think there are two areas that have come out of these exchanges which are broadly all discussed by everyone, and they all go to the point that you've just touched on. One is about a disagreement which Henry made sharp with Mick. I am with Henry. I don't recognise and indeed Joyce, it's really the end of the table there, isn't it? Our two colleagues here, I don't know quite where you're going to stand on this, Richard, the notion that in this country we've had this what did Joyce call it? The crisis of the loyalty to the state. I just don't think that's there. You've only got to walk around and see how many poppies are being worn over this weekend. You've only got to see the turnout to the royal wedding, as I was discussing with someone during the fire break. There are these fundamental senses of community, which are, yes, indeed, accelerated during times of perceived crisis, and indeed they are. When we had the tube attacks, I remember very well walking through London and seeing that sort of doggedness, and there was a sense of spirit and community in adversity. And it links to the larger question, which is where I'd have a sharp disagreement with one thing that Henry said and a sharp agreement with the other. Let me make my own position absolutely clear in case you want to pigeonhole me. I'm not somebody who's here to argue for the proposition that everything should be kept secret unless you can think of good reason to make it public, so I'm not Sir Humphrey Appleby. I think it's extremely important that we allow information, which is a great restorative and cleanser. The issue about whistleblowing, various of us have said a good thing to do. I don't disagree. The issue is what you blow into. Now, this is where the 2 points link up, Claire. because in our unwritten constitution, we do actually have mechanisms which permit this corrective, in which the Fifth Estate can often stimulate a change in the formal constitutional arrangements. And what I mean by that, and we've seen it happening this year, we saw it happen over the Murdoch affair, we've seen it over areas of my interest to do with defence and security, we've seen it in areas of public administration. I'm referring here to the extraordinary and, to Walter Bagot, completely expected phenomenon of the ship of state which has been tilted to the government side for 15, 20 years, righting itself as Parliament rediscovers its responsibility and power. And it does it in two ways. One is through the interrogatory powers of the select committees. And that, in my view, is the place to which whistleblowers should be directed, because that is how you prevent it, Richard, then having the corrosive consequence which you described. And the second, we saw it just happen last Monday, are the consequences of Mr. Cameron, our present Prime Minister, choosing to challenge his backbenchers for whatever reason he chose to do. The most interesting thing about the speeches that were made by backbenchers from his own side was how many of them, particularly the young ones who had just come in last year, argued by many to be the most intelligent and able new intake of MPs that we've seen for a generation, who stood up and said in the House of Commons, I am faced with a crisis of conscience. I'm sorry you've put me here, Prime Minister, but if you put me here, then my loyalty to the whip, or your threat to my quote-unquote parliamentary career, is clearly secondary to my loyalty, A, to my principles, and B, to my constituents. And so naturally I will vote with them, which they did. It was, from Mr. Cameron's point of view, a historic mistake, and the full implications are not yet clear. So those two things link together. But the issue that's before us all, Claire, and it's across this table, we may want to thrash it out with the audience, is this notion of whether those of us who think actually there is still an England there, I mean, I actually think I live in it. I came up from Devon this morning. People down there wouldn't recognise this notion of a crisis of community, I assure you. What they would feel is that they've been betrayed by the elite, but they haven't been betrayed in the same way that the people outside St Paul's have been betrayed. They've been betrayed over things like the European Union. They've been betrayed by the refusal to give them their voice.
Far be it from me to be seen as the, gloom and doom merchant, which I've always tried to avoid being. But let's just be sober and honest about this. What Henry talks about, a stable society, is actually a stagnant society. There is no political contest in our society. Nobody believes in anything on either side of a political debate. There is nothing to replace the old, exhausted left-right debate. So in any terms of a political sense, you have not so much stability as stagnation. And below that, you have a very kind of festering disquiet. As far as loyalty to the state goes, I think it's self-evident. And you've only got to contrast the public reaction to the Falklands War of 1982 with any of the wars of the last 10 years to see the British public's general disassociation from nationalist politics of the old form. The mass celebration of the royal wedding was more to do with celebrity culture than any kind of traditional monarchist reaction. Interesting, all those people waving Union Jacks on the Mall had been given them by OK magazine and Hello magazine, which is what they said in the middle if you look closely at the flags. The reaction to 7/7 and the London bombing, I think, is a quite different thing, something that I would see as being very positive, which is a spontaneous people coming together in adversity. That's got nothing to do with any kind of traditional nationalist politics. So we are living in a society where commitment and loyalty are pretty hard to find. Blind loyalty to sports teams is there. That's what
he knows a lot about that.
Many of us feel, for better or worse. And that's all right because that's football or rugby. That's not real life. And it's kind of it's easy to get your rocks off and be passionate about that in a way that people find it quite difficult to be about political ideas or things in reality these days.
I do think the sport thing is interesting because I think from a kind of anthropological point of view, the persistence of blind loyalty in sort of sporting allegiances shows how strongly people do want that experience of just being with other people in a way that they don't have to constantly interrogate. So it kind of psychologically it's quite interesting, and men clearly need and want it even more than women, although a lot of women enjoy it as well. So there's something very interesting there, but I just want to agree very wholeheartedly with something that Richard, and I do mean Richard this time, said, which was about the need for a project. I'm not at all a pessimist about the general texture of society. I think we take a lot of its positives for granted. I think it is quite stable. And I think and there is, as Henry said, a huge amount of kindness around. But I think what British society, and I use the term advisedly, now lacks and probably has done for the last kind of quarter century or so, is a strong sense of what its project is, or a strong shared sense at least of what its project is, which helps to bind people together and to give them a reason to put up with a certain amount of confidentiality, secrecy or whatever, if it is in the interests of the project. I think in the post-war years there was a sense of a project, certainly looking at it from a Scottish angle, there was a sense of a project into which most people in Britain could buy in, or at least a majority, which was about constructing, you know, a kind of cradle-to-grave society, welfare state, all the rest of it. In the Thatcher period, that was bust. What replaced it was a neoliberal project from which, in Scotland, at least 80% of the people dissented. So in that sense, that nothing has replaced that sort of 30-year post-war project. And that creates a kind of a crisis, but it's not, I'm not suggesting it's in any way an apocalyptic crisis where everybody's about to run out and start rioting, far from it. Still have very high levels of loyalty to local communities and so on. Many people are not as socially mobile as we caricature our society as being, and still tend to live, you know, within a few miles of where they're born, all the rest of it. So the situation is extremely complex, but I think the loss of the long-term project to which you can subject other priorities like openness or knowing everything or whatever is something that is very serious actually in the sort of deep texture of society, and I think that's what's playing itself out now.
I mean, it does seem to me that actually people have made a virtue of the fact we live in a post-ideological society. It's not something I like, but they've made a virtue of it. And a kind of what works audit is kind of the way politics go, the kind of managerialism in politics that actually would indicate that, I mean, as you know, pragmatism in politics now has replaced loyalty. You know, you can't be loyal to a managerial, pragmatic aspect of politics. I mean, you know, it's kind of like, will you be loyal to David Cameron, who will change his mind about what he believes next week if he thinks it's not going to play well with the electorate? Is not, that would be loyal to a man, but it wouldn't be loyal to an idea. So surely that affects things. And the other thing I was going to say, despite my defence of loyalty, is that I actually once organised a strike. I organised a lot of strikes actually, but I once organised a strike against an imposed loyalty clause when I was teaching in further education, where the college brought in loyalty clauses that we had to sign, which basically said that I couldn't say anything negative, not only about the college that I worked in, but about the sector that I worked in. And I actually had to write under a pseudonym in educational publications so that I wouldn't get sacked, even though they knew it was me and it was all very complicated. But I mean, that wasn't the point. The point was I still had to use it and, in order to not get sacked and then deny I was who I was, if you see what I mean. But what they said was that you cannot leave this college and say anything derogatory at all. And I suppose if there is a scary bit on the business side, which is what I was going to say, is this sort of idea that you sign your life away. And that's a new thing, by the way. Those loyalty clauses didn't exist. The formal demand for loyalty is actually more apparent in corporations now, maybe as a consequence of whistleblowing in a way, but it was like you're not allowed to say certain things.
I think there's a distinction between what Wikileaks was doing and what whistleblowing is that hasn't been made. In that whistleblowing is saying there is something specific that my organisation is doing that I don't like, and hopefully I've been through the proper channels, complained, hasn't happened, and therefore I think the media have to know to make an effort to stop whatever it is that's going on. And Wikileaks is leaking information for the sake of leaking information, not because I think that something the organisation is doing is wrong necessarily, but that everyone has a right to know this information. And that ties in again with the Freedom of Information Act. But that distinction I think should be made, because I think whistleblowing is absolutely necessary. I mean, I like football and I hate FIFA. And I wish that the whistleblowing in FIFA had been a bigger story than it was, because there was a chance, there was about a week-long period where something could actually have changed, and then Sepp Blatter won the election and it sort of ran off with it. And you can't, that I think is a fantastic thing. Something that is leaking information because they think the judgment the government has made about whether it should be public information or not is wrong, I disagree with, because, I mean, there's a fundamental lack of faith in politics at the moment after the MP's expenses, etc. But I think you need some of that for any country to run a defence to have a defence secretary to have a job, even if he may not anymore. You need something, I guess.
Too much information can sometimes be counterproductive to better decision making. And if people are on this side and selective disclosure has to be the consequence either voluntarily or as as a consequence, then who is best positioned to make the decision of what selective information that is to be disclosed? Second is the long-term intent that Richard touched on. Do you think about the fact that we live in the world that the dynamics between people are changing faster than the past, in the sense that we have wider access to information to people? The changing dynamics and the pace of which it is changing at is making it more difficult to form, to align long-term interest between people.
A simple question, really, I guess, on the why this is happening, because when I work a lot with young people, and people don't have any trust or expectations really from politicians, but they do also have a sense that everything in politicians' professional and personal life should be laid bare and exposed to them. I wonder if there is an element to which that's a response to increased surveillance, and that the feeling that that's okay, it comes from outside and comes from above rather than comes from that generation themselves.
I think I completely agree with Henry, and I completely agree about the fact that whistleblowing is very important, especially when we live in an era where there are so many conflicts and when lies are peddled to the electorate to kind of decide to go to war. And this has been happening since the Spanish-American War, where the US main went down and that lie was peddled to the American people. The WMD claim before Iraq and the 45-minute claim. Where I think Julian Assange has shot himself in the foot is that he's trivialized his website by, talking about the details of, the daughter of Islam Karimov, the dictator of Uzbekistan, and her, stints in a nightclub and everything. He trivializes that issue.
It's an old saying, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you. It looks after us. But I guess the reaction, how people are reacting to that is changing, and sort of looking in the WikiLeaks sort of situation, are people who are whistleblowing being glorified, and the backlash against that. I guess the litigative reaction to people who whistleblow, journalists being under increased scrutiny to kind of reveal their sources. And then, where do you end up, we've had this recent case about abuse in care homes versus the WikiLeaks. Those are both examples of whistleblowing, and I guess where do we kind of draw the line and where does that go?
It is actually funny that you were saying that, though, about being paranoid, because I was having this argument with somebody I know who actually works for a big multinational, nothing as it happens to do with anything, I just know him, and he was disagreeing with me and saying he wanted total transparency as I was sitting in his flat. And I said, right, when I leave this flat, how do you think anyone else would view this discussion? Right, you are sitting with an old Marxist having this conversation, and they saw me leaving. And then he said, well, he literally said, have you told anyone you were coming round, right? And I just thought, this is like, I said, that was meant to be a joke, not make it, and suddenly he felt, yes, how would I explain this peculiar scenario? So you can actually become paranoid because they're out to get you, because they think everything that goes on in somebody's flat behind closed doors is bound to be sinister. And I don't know that I want to live by how people might imagine I'm living my life.
I'd just like to counter a general assertion that there's some sort of greater loyalty to the country at the moment. I think a lot of people have been alienated by politics, and I think there's definitely a difference between the loyalty of people who are privy to information in institutions, and those people I think definitely have a responsibility to whistleblow and shed light on the activities if they think it's in the public interest. However, I agree with Joyce and about the loss of loyalty that's linked to sort of a long-term project. There's not enough of a balance between what the public feel and then what Parliament and institutions are doing that has sort of lost that loyalty.
I'd just like to say, firstly, that the I think there's a general lack of trust in communities, and you can see that with like neighbours being encouraged to spy on one another to expose benefit fraud, or the CRB checks and vetting. I think without trust in communities, it's no wonder why there's no loyalty to communities anymore. And onto the whole issue of sort of WikiLeaks and whistleblowing, I do agree with the thing that whistleblowing should be a last resort. Had the investments of bankers, or the risky investments that they were taking, had they been exposed earlier on or before, then perhaps we wouldn't have been in such a crisis that we're in now. I don't think it's the actual whistleblowing that is wrong, but it's the intent of what you're doing and how you do it and what you want to gain from it that is important to look at.
I do think that the last government, my mind is made up on the current one, but I do think the last one, there was a pattern of mistrust shown from the public. And that did include all this vetting procedures, the proposals for the ID card, which had massive surveillance background to them, and the surveillance of cameras, and all sorts of things. And I felt there was a great programme of mistrust, which was very unworthy of the government, unmerited by the society we live in. Crime has been going down for the last 20 years, steadily going down, as it is in America. It's not something we understand or necessarily take into our arguments, but our society is a very peaceful one. And I felt that the pattern of mistrust and suspicion that the government implemented over the last 11 years was exactly your point. It did encourage people to feel suspicious of each other, and it was very undesirable.
When you're looking at loyalty, you're either focusing it on a person or a project, a long-term goal, or a combination of the two. Focusing loyalty on an individual typically requires a great deal of knowledge of that individual. It's someone who you will have probably a fairly intimate relationship with, and therefore can develop that in isolation of a longer-term goal. A longer-term goal you can have loyalty to without necessarily being too concerned about the individuals. And maybe that's why we struggle with politics today, that we have neither. We have neither intimacy around what are, I suppose, almost airbrushed individuals at the seat of government, or clarity around what their long-term goals and beliefs are. And I fully support what Mick was saying, that without that clarity of what are politicians about, it's very hard to engender any loyalty at all.
I would like to pick up, please, on the lady barrister down in the front who left her wig behind and obviously wore a hat instead. Because what you've done, if I may say, is exactly what was needed for this debate, which is to distinguish the two cases so clearly. Because the argument about WikiLeaks and FOI is distinguishable, as you said, from the argument about whistleblowing. They're quite different narratives. And I want to link it to making one observation, which I can't leave lying before we end, which was the challenge. It was even issued in those terms by my distinguished colleague down here. I challenge anyone to show that there was any danger lying in the WikiLeaks leaks. Well, there most certainly was, and it didn't lie in any of the tittle-tattle that was in it. It lay in the revelation of pattern. And if you're going to reveal patterns of communications to people who wish you no good, and we're talking here about, really quite serious people who have very clear senses of identity, very clear senses of purposes, and who are maligned. Okay, the whistleblowing point links to the dear leader's observation about her gagging clause, right? I mean, as it happens, my wife's a consultant in the NHS. And in the public services now, in the NHS, these things are extremely common. So that's one of the reasons. I mean, my wife spends a great deal of time fighting the bureaucracy in the NHS, who are there precisely to stop people saying all the ghastly things that are going on. She actually joined up to, cure people. It's an old-fashioned idea, I know, but not to fight bureaucrats. And this is, to link it to the point that Claire made at the very beginning, this is the reason that Michael Gove and his political advisors had to have recourse to using Gmail for the same reason that I do, which is that he was faced. Look, here is a minister who has read Gramsci. We know that for sure. He understands three-generational strategies. He understands how those who see the educational service as an instrument for social engineering are going to take no prisoners and are going to try and frustrate the incursion of transformation in the education service that he's driving.
A very, very important point that Henry raised about the historical campaign for the coverage of Parliament. puts this really in a nutshell, because there you're talking about our right to know what politicians say in public, what their public political positions are, what the public acts of governments are, and who has written the Queen's speech and all the rest of it. That is entirely different from the current obsession with what did Michael Gove email to his mates, and what did Adam Werrity and Liam Fox get up to in that Dubai hotel. This relates back to what Richard was talking about politics having lost their meaning for people, political language having lost its meaning for people, and so we are always more concerned with what we don't know than what we do know. What don't we know? What's not what we're not being told? What's this? Oh yes, I heard him make that speech. But what's he really mean? What's his hidden agenda? And that becomes the obsession with the political life, and it's something which really breeds mistrust and suspicion about everything, so that you can never believe anything. All politicians are liars all the time. Everybody, nobody can be trusted in what they say and what they say they stand for. I think, if we ask what damage did Wikileaks do, I don't think specifically it did very much damage at all, because most of it's pretty, I mean, that just shows you how uninteresting most of the stuff that was produced were. But what it did do was it really reinforced a culture of suspicion and mistrust.
Well, I think through this discussion there's been a kind of attempt to draw the line, really, a line between what's a sort of useful form of openness and where it just becomes a kind of mindless game, really. And I don't think, it's obviously not an easy question, but I think we've had some quite useful kind of discussion around that. But one of the things I would say, and it's in response to the lady somewhere back there who talked about, you know, the young kids that she works with who just feel they have an absolute right to know everything about politicians' lives. And it seems to me often, as somebody commentating on the day-to-day of politics, that obsession with exposing what are really quite minor private infringements by politicians has in a sense become a substitute for politics. I mean, most of these things would be regarded as absolutely trivial, things about their private lives, things about who they send Gmails to, all the rest of it, if they were on a project which people actually thought was important. So I think this obsession with kind of trivial forms of openness, particularly around the political system, is a symptom of the failure of politics to raise its game and to be about the things that people really need addressed.
Well, my point was basically taken on by Mick just now when he said we're more concerned with what we don't know, because it seems to me a society which encourages whistleblowing is a society, certainly a political elite, which is not just insecure as to what people are loyal to, but also just doesn't seem to know what people really believe in and think. Because I know one country which really institutionalized whistleblowing, and that is the former East Germany. I come from Berlin, so I believe I know a little bit about it. People were actually encouraged to be whistleblowers. Every third person was a Stasi informant, on paper at least. And it wasn't because the elite was worried that they would be against Stalinist politics. It was because the elite didn't know what people really thought and believed. And if you look at the files today, it's just the WikiLeaks equivalent. It's every little detail of people's lives, of every little thought which was ever mentioned anywhere in any closed room needed to be publicized.
One of the interesting things about whistleblowing is that it's a moral process. You know, if you take a business which is an amoral institution, and there is someone who strongly believes that that business is doing something morally wrong, that's why they leak the information.
I wonder whether the rise of employee whistleblowers is because so many of the professional auditors and analysers of businesses have failed to do their duty over time. So it's putting more pressure on employees to come forward because those that we trust to audit and look and keep companies straight haven't done their job. And Henry, you said about the damage of the diplomatic cables. I wonder whether one casualty is that diplomats and other bureaucrats won't feel that they're able to be honest about what they feel in future communications.
Okay.
So that they might censor themselves.
I came to this session because I love Henry Porter and I can't bear to leave with us disagreeing. I'm afraid I cheered Tony Blair when he talked about that on his Channel 4 interview about his book. And that's because I work in mainstream science and I absolutely hate FOI. I'm personally being FOI'd by, and this is a short version, climate skeptics, animal rights extremists, some of them convicted, I've now discovered, mobile phone activists, ME patients, etc. And none of them are looking for my data. I've spent my 10 years in science arguing looking for these scientists to make their data available. They're looking for my private emails.
I think the intrusion into people's private lives to use or to get leverage on some public issue is an absolute disgrace, and I abhor it. I think the woman lady here who said that the Stasi were the equivalent of WikiLeaks was wrong. What the Stasi did was to gain information in order to have leverage on other people, to force them to do things, to inform on those incidents, and to basically terrorize the community. I've spent a lot of time in East Germany and a lot of time talking to Stasi officers, asking them about the way they behaved, and it was entirely to enforce the will of a kleptocracy at the top of the East German government, a group of people who had all the luxuries of the West and kept them to themselves and kept the power to themselves.
I do think one of the things we need to reflect on is to avoid at all costs making whistleblowing a badge of honour, because that does create a very unhelpful dynamic where if you're not whistleblowing there must be something wrong with you. And actually I think we should look upon whistleblowing as sadness, because it means, or it should mean, that all other avenues have been used and have actually not proved to be satisfactory. I'm not going to get into a defence of auditors or their activities. That could be a very, very long discussion between the two of us, but if you'd like to search me out afterwards, maybe. And I do think you've got to come back ultimately to look at the motivation behind the action, because it is somewhat naive to assume that all whistleblowers act with a positive motive. That just is not the case. So if you can discern to a positive motive, whistleblowing is undoubtedly a good thing. If you can't and your motive's not clear, I think you have to question it really hard.
Do not confuse the narrative about the WikiLeaks and the aggressive use of FOI, I've also been the victim of that, just like Fiona, with whistleblowing. Whistleblowing can be a cleansing and a restorative thing. And a point which hasn't been picked up, and I make my last point, is the gentleman in the middle who talked about telling lies. Because, of course, it is the case that in a social contract, if you're going to ask for the loyalty and the trust of those who are ruled, then the rulers have to keep the trust as well. And so, of course, Tony Blair will go to his grave and will have engraved on his heart the lies that he told about the Iraq War. The irony is that the lies that he told were about weapons which were not there in that form, because he was told by his spin doctors that the public were too stupid to understand the rather more complicated case about weapons and Saddam, which was actually a true case, which isn't our subject here today. But having told the lie, it was impossible to tell the truth. And once you've done that, it has this awful corrosive effect, out of which then comes the justification, the self-justification of the Assanges and so on. So there are two sides to this.
First of all, I think we are in danger of missing the point that the meaning of whistleblowing has been redefined. That what was once seen as being the exception is now seen as being the norm, and what was once seen as being disloyalty is now seen as being an act of duty, even to the point where I heard recently about managers in local government using the name of whistleblowing in order to pursue workers who they said weren't pursuing council policy properly. Things can change meaning, and we need to be abreast of that. I do very much believe in privacy. I do not believe in privacy laws. I think there are more than enough formal and informal restrictions on the press in this country as it is. And as Mark said a long time ago, I think if you want a free press, you cannot grasp the rose without the thorn. And finally, ultimately, the way that you find out the truth that we need to know about important events like Iraq wars or anything else is not going to be through leaks. It is going to be, because there's no shortage of factual information about what's going on in any of those war zones. It's going to be through analysis, and it's going to be through argument. And we're going to have the space to work out what we think before we can go public and win those arguments one way or the other.
I think that whatever our conclusions about the situation that we're in at the moment, there is no going back. If you look at the political history of the last 30 years, you are, as the first two speakers have already said, looking at a situation where people have been betrayed by their commercial elites, betrayed by their political elites, and betrayed by other elites that they should have been able to trust. And one consequence of that is that people want to open up the files and look at the information, and that is not going to be put into reverse. us. So what we need to do is accept that we're now living in an age of FOI, accept that we're living in an age of whistleblowing, and accept that we're living in an age where internet publication is going to play a role. And what we need to do is to get much more clever, much more nuanced and much more mature about the ways we regulate those activities so that they don't cripple our society with needless information, but so that we can get the information when we need it, and we have the right to do so.
Thank you very much indeed.